Three black Cadillacs don't pull into a forgotten neighborhood unless someone's life is about to change forever. At exactly 8:12 on a quiet Tuesday morning, every curtain on Maple Ridge Lane shifted just enough for curious eyes to peek outside. Children paused their bicycles. A mail carrier stopped halfway across the street. Even old Mr. Jenkins lowered his coffee mug without taking another sip. Three gleaming black Cadillacs rolled slowly toward the smallest house on the block, their polished paint reflecting the pale morning sun like mirrors. They moved in perfect silence, too elegant, too expensive, too deliberate for a place where most pickup trucks had dents older than their owners. Neighbors exchanged worried glances. Someone whispered that the IRS must have finally found somebody. Another guessed it had to be federal agents. No one imagined the truth. The lead Cadillac came to a gentle stop in front of a weathered white farmhouse with peeling paint and a porch that leaned slightly after decades of harsh Midwest winters. The second and third vehicles lined up behind it with military precision. The engines shut off together. For one long heartbeat, nothing happened. The street seemed to hold its breath. Then suited men stepped out first, each carrying himself with quiet professionalism rather than intimidation. They looked around carefully before opening the rear passenger door of the middle Cadillac. A woman emerged, dressed in a tailored cream-colored coat that caught the soft morning light. Her blonde hair rested neatly over one shoulder, and although dark sunglasses hid her eyes, nothing could conceal the grace with which she stood. She looked like someone who belonged on magazine covers or walking through the headquarters of a Fortune 500 company, not standing on a cracked sidewalk outside a modest mechanic's home. She removed her sunglasses slowly, revealing tired blue eyes that carried something far heavier than wealth. Gratitude. Across the yard, the front door creaked open. Ethan Walker stepped onto the porch wearing faded blue jeans, worn work boots, and a gray flannel shirt with sleeves rolled above strong forearms marked by years of honest labor. A grease-stained still colored one sleeve from the pickup truck he had repaired before sunrise. He froze when he saw the unexpected visitors. His 9-year-old daughter Lily peeked around his side, holding a bowl of cereal in both hands. "Daddy," she whispered softly, "are those movie stars?" Ethan managed the smallest smile without answering. He had never seen any of those cars before. He certainly had never met the elegant woman walking toward him now. Or so he believed. The woman stopped only a few feet away. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the yard while a wind chime, hanging from the porch roof, sang a quiet melody. Then, without warning, the woman stepped forward and wrapped both arms around Ethan. She held him as though she had been searching for him her entire life. The neighborhood fell completely silent. Ethan stood perfectly still, too surprised to react, while Lily blinked in confusion beside him. Finally, the woman whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "You gave me another tomorrow." Ethan's brow tightened gently. He searched her face, trying to place a memory that refused to come. Somewhere deep inside, a single image flickered like distant lightning across dark water. 24 hours earlier, during the worst storm of the season, a private jet had disappeared beneath the icy surface of Silver Lake, and one ordinary single father had made a decision that no one else was willing to make. The memory returned all at once, as clear as rain striking a windshield. 24 hours earlier, Ethan Walker had started that Monday the same way he had started nearly every weekday for the past 6 years. His alarm rang at 5:15 in the morning. By 5:30, fresh coffee filled the little farmhouse with the rich smell of roasted beans while bacon sizzled gently in an old cast iron skillet. Lily wandered into the kitchen wearing oversized socks and one of her late mother's faded college sweatshirts that nearly reached her knees. She rubbed her sleepy eyes and smiled the same smile Ethan had not gone a single day without protecting since the funeral. "Morning, Daddy." "Morning, sunshine." He slid 2 pancakes on her plate, cutting them into small squares the way she liked. Outside, gray clouds stretched across the Nebraska sky, thick enough to hide every trace of sunrise. The local weather station had warned about severe thunderstorms moving through the county by afternoon, but storms were simply another part of life in the Midwest. Ethan glanced through the kitchen window toward his aging Ford F-150 parked beside the detached garage. It had more than 200,000 miles on the odometer and a passenger door that only opened from the inside, yet he kept it running with the same patience he brought to everything else in life. After walking Lily to the school bus, he drove the familiar 12 miles into Ashford, where Walker Auto Repair occupied the corner of an old brick building beside a grain elevator. The garage was nothing special. 2 service bays, faded blue tool cabinets, a coffee machine older than most of the customers, and a wooden sign his wife had painted years before that simply read, "Honest work matters." Ethan never replaced it, even after the paint began to crack beneath years of summer heat and winter snow. Customers trusted him because he fixed only what needed fixing. If a repair could wait another month, he said so. If a family could save money by choosing a used part instead of a new one, he installed the used part without hesitation. Some people called him old-fashioned. Ethan preferred the word fair. Around noon, Mrs. Evelyn Carter stopped by with homemade apple pie to thank him for repairing her grandson's pickup without charging labor after the young man lost his job. Ethan accepted only 1 slice and insisted she keep the rest for her family. "You cannot keep giving people discounts forever," his longtime friend and co-worker Ben laughed while organizing wrenches. Ethan only smiled as he tightened the lug nuts on an aging Chevrolet. "Sometimes people need a little breathing room more than I need another dollar." Ben shook his head. "One of these days, somebody's going to repay all that kindness." Ethan wiped his hands on a clean shop towel. Kindness is not a loan. If you expect it back, it stops being kindness. The words lingered quietly between them. By late afternoon, the wind had changed. The air felt heavier. The sky turned the color of worn steel, and distant thunder rolled across the plains with slow determination. Ethan locked the garage earlier than usual, wanting to reach home before the worst of the storm arrived. He had promised Lily they would finish building the birdhouse they had started over the weekend. As his truck followed the narrow county road hugging the shoreline of Silver Lake, the first heavy raindrops struck the windshield. He reached forward to turn on the wipers, just as something enormous flashed through the dark clouds above, descending far lower than any aircraft should ever be. The aircraft emerged from the storm like a silver ghost fighting against the wind. Ethan instinctively eased his truck onto the gravel shoulder, his eyes never leaving the sky. The twin engines sounded uneven, not loud enough to suggest panic, but different enough to make every instinct he had developed during years of volunteer emergency response whisper that something was terribly wrong. Rain streaked across the windshield in heavy sheets, and flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the sleek business jet as it descended lower over Silver Lake. Miles away, inside the spacious cabin, Victoria Sterling tightened her grip on the armrest without saying a word. She had flown hundreds of hours aboard private aircraft, crossing oceans for board meetings, charity events, and factory visits. Fear had never been part of the routine. Today felt different. Her chief pilot remained calm, speaking quietly with air traffic controllers while the co-pilot carefully monitored every instrument glowing across the cockpit. Neither man raised his voice. Neither allowed urgency to replace professionalism. That calm somehow made the silence inside the cabin even heavier. Victoria rested one hand gently across her stomach, protecting the small life only a handful of people knew she carried. This trip had been private for a reason. She had traveled under a different name, without assistants, photographers, or corporate security. She wanted one weekend away from boardrooms and headlines before announcing both her pregnancy and her temporary leave from Sterling Aerospace. Outside the oval window, gray clouds swallowed nearly everything except brief flashes of rain and water below. A flight attendant approached with a reassuring smile that never quite reached her eyes. "We may experience a rough landing, but the crew is fully prepared. Please keep your seatbelt fastened. Victoria Nadir Pelaitri." "Thank you." She believed her. Confidence, she had learned, often sounded quiet. Back on the shoreline, Ethan stepped out of his truck despite the rain soaking through his flannel within seconds. The wind pushed against him with surprising force. He watched the aircraft circle once, then lower again, flying barely above the dark surface of the lake. The landing lights reflected across the restless water like trembling ribbons of gold. Something about the angle did not look right. Not impossible, just wrong. His pulse quickened. Years earlier, before life had taken unexpected turns, Ethan had completed specialized rescue training while volunteering with the county emergency response team. He had learned one lesson he never forgot. Seconds mattered long before sirens arrived. The aircraft continued descending with remarkable control despite the storm. There was no explosion, no chaos, only an incredibly skilled crew guiding an impossible situation toward the safest outcome they could find. The wheels never touched pavement. Instead, the sleek jet settled onto the rain-covered lake with surprising grace before sliding across the choppy water. For one hopeful moment, it appeared everything might be all right. Then the aircraft slowed abruptly and drifted lower as water surrounded the fuselage. Ethan reached for his phone and dialed emergency services while never taking his eyes off the lake. "Small private aircraft on Silver Lake," he said steadily. "It made it down, but it is taking on water. Send everyone." He ended the call and looked around. A few other drivers had stopped along the roadside. They stared silently through the rain, frozen by uncertainty. One man whispered, "The rescue boats will be here soon." Ethan looked back, toward the distant aircraft. Soon was a word that sounded comforting on dry land. Out there, every passing second carried a different meaning. Without another thought, he pulled a bright orange emergency flotation vest from behind the seat of his truck, slipped it over his shoulders, and ran toward the shoreline as thunder rolled once more across the dark Nebraska sky. Ethan's boots splashed through ankle-deep water as he reached the narrow wooden dock that stretched into Silver Lake. Rain pounded against the weathered planks, turning every step into a careful balance between urgency and control. Behind him, someone shouted that rescue crews were only minutes away. Ethan did not turn around. He had spent enough years helping at flood rescues to understand that minutes could become the longest distance in the world. He tightened the straps of the flotation vest across his chest, slipped a rescue rope around one shoulder, and dove into the cold water. The icy shock stole his breath for only an instant before training replaced instinct. His arms cut steadily through the waves, each stroke carrying him closer to the motionless aircraft. Wind whipped across the lake, pushing rain sideways while small waves slapped against the silver fuselage. Inside the cabin, the emergency lights cast a soft amber glow over frightened faces. The crew remained remarkably composed, calmly directing passengers toward the nearest exits. Victoria sat quietly, listening to every instruction while trying to slow her breathing. She could hear water somewhere beneath the cabin floor, not rushing, not roaring, simply reminding everyone that time was moving forward. She whispered a silent prayer, resting one hand over her unborn child. She had spent her life solving billion-dollar problems with strategy and confidence. Yet in that moment, none of her wealth, influence, or accomplishments could change the simple truth that survival depended upon ordinary courage. Ethan reached the aircraft and grabbed a handhold near the main cabin door. The fuselage rocked gently beneath his weight. A crew member had managed to open the emergency exit, helping passengers step carefully into inflatable life. Rafts despite the relentless rain. Ethan steadied the raft with both hands while one passenger after another climbed aboard safely. There was no panic, only determination. "Keep moving," the crew member called with calm authority. One at a time. Ethan nodded. "You're doing great. Keep them coming." The final passengers emerged, followed by the flight attendant who had remained behind until everyone else was safely outside. Ethan counted quickly. Something felt incomplete. The flight attendant looked back toward the cabin, her face suddenly changing. One passenger is still inside. Ethan glanced through the open doorway. Dim emergency lights flickered across the quiet cabin. Without hesitation, he climbed aboard. Water covered the aisle floor, rising slowly around his boots. He moved carefully, calling out in a steady voice. "Can anyone hear me?" A faint reply came from near the rear of the cabin. "I am here." Ethan followed the sound and found Victoria kneeling beside a seat, momentarily slowed after stopping to retrieve a small leather journal that had slipped beneath the road during the emergency. She looked up, surprised to see a stranger instead of another crew member. Their eyes met for the first time. There was no recognition of status, no assumptions about wealth or importance. Ethan saw only a frightened woman who needed help. Victoria saw only a soaked man whose calm voice somehow made the storm seem farther away. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Yes." He offered his hand without another question. She accepted it. Together, they walked carefully toward the open cabin door while the rain drummed steadily against the aircraft outside. Reaching the exit, Ethan helped her into the waiting life raft before climbing in after her to steady its movement. As rescue boats finally appeared through the curtain of rain with flashing blue and amber lights reflecting across the lake, Victoria looked toward Ethan with grateful eyes. "I do not even know your name," she said softly. Ethan smiled with quiet warmth. "Names can wait. Right now, I'm just glad you are safe." He turned toward the approaching rescue crews, never imagining that those simple words would remain in Victoria Sterling's heart long after the storm itself had disappeared. The rescue boats reached the aircraft only moments later, their flashing lights cutting through the fading storm like quiet promises that everyone would make it home. Emergency responders welcomed each passenger aboard with calm voices and steady hands while medical teams completed routine evaluations. Ethan answered a few simple questions from a deputy sheriff, confirmed that everyone had been accounted for, and quietly stepped away before anyone thought to ask for more. He had no interest in cameras, recognition, or headlines. His soaked boots left small puddles across the wooden dock as he walked back toward his old pickup truck. The rain had already begun to soften into a light drizzle, and the clouds slowly drifted east, allowing the first pale streaks of evening sunlight to break across Silver Lake. Ethan climbed behind the wheel and looked at the clock. Lily would already be home from school. He smiled to himself, started the engine, and drove away before the television news vans arrived. Inside the ambulance, Victoria accepted a warm blanket around her shoulders while a paramedic checked her pulse and asked a series of routine questions. She answered politely, but her attention remained fixed on the empty shoreline outside the window. "Where's the man who helped me?" she asked. One firefighter looked around before shaking his head gently. "I think he already left." Victoria blinked in surprise. "He left?" "Yes, ma'am." He did not wait for reporters or introductions. She lowered her eyes for a moment, almost unable to believe it. Throughout her career, she had met thousands of people eager to shake her hand once they learned who she was. Yet the one person who had reached her without hesitation had walked away without even asking her name. The thought stayed with her long after the ambulance began rolling toward the regional medical center. Across town, Ethan pulled into the gravel driveway just as Lily burst through the front door wearing bright yellow rain boots. She ran across the yard and wrapped her arms around him before he could even climb out of the truck. "Daddy, you are soaked." He laughed softly. "That is what happens when you forget how determined rain can be." Lily studied his tired face. "Did something happen?" Ethan rested one hand gently on her shoulder as they walked toward the porch together. "Some people needed help today." She looked up at him with quiet concern. "Are they all right?" Ethan thought about the woman with grateful blue eyes and the composed flight crew that had protected every passenger until the very end. He nodded. "Yes, they're going to be just fine." Lily smiled with visible relief. "Mom will be proud of you." Ethan paused for only a second before opening the front door. Those simple words carried more weight than any award ever could. That evening they finished the little wooden birdhouse exactly as promised. Lily carefully painted tiny white flowers along the roof, while Ethan attached the final pieces with patient hands. The smell of fresh pine mixed with homemade tomato soup filling the kitchen, and soft music played from an old radio resting on the windowsill. It felt like every ordinary evening they had shared since learning how to build a new life together after loss. Miles away, however, Victoria lay awake in a quiet hospital room, staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping. The physicians had given her reassuring news, and both she and her unborn child were healthy. Yet one question refused to leave her heart. Who was the quiet man who disappeared before anyone could thank him? She reached for her phone, looked at her chief of staff, and spoke with calm certainty. Tomorrow morning, I want every available resource focused on finding him. Not because he saved the chief executive officer of Sterling Aerospace, because he expected nothing in return. Morning arrived with clear skies, as though the storm had never existed. Sunlight spilled across the rolling fields outside Ashford, drying the last traces of rain from the roads, while Ethan unlocked the doors to Walker Auto Repair at exactly 7 o'clock. The familiar scent of motor oil, fresh coffee, and worn leather greeted him like an old friend. He switched on the lights, rolled open the service bay doors, and settled into another ordinary day. A retired schoolteacher arrived, first with a sedan that made an unusual rattle over every speed bump. Ethan listened carefully, smiled, and assured her it was a simple repair rather than the expensive transmission replacement another shop had recommended. She thanked him with genuine relief before taking a seat in the waiting area. To Ethan, it was simply another morning. Across the state, however, the executive offices of Sterling Aerospace had become unusually quiet. Victoria Sterling sat at the head of a polished conference table, but no financial reports or merger proposals occupied her attention. Instead, security specialists, legal advisors, and members of her executive team reviewed every available piece of information from the previous afternoon. Highway traffic cameras, emergency response records, local news footage, statements from first responders. The rescue itself had already become a regional headline because of the remarkable emergency landing. Yet every interview shared one frustrating detail. The unidentified civilian who had entered the water first had disappeared before anyone could learn his name. Victoria folded her hands calmly. "Keep looking," she said with quiet confidence. A man who chooses to leave without recognition is exactly the kind of man worth finding. Hours passed before a young security analyst gently cleared his throat. "We found a traffic camera approximately 2 miles from Silver Lake. It captured a pickup truck leaving shortly after emergency crews arrived." He enlarged the image. The truck appeared weathered, with faded paint and a cracked rear bumper. Another search connected the license plate to a small auto repair shop in Ashford. A second image revealed Ethan stepping out of the vehicle earlier that afternoon, wearing the same gray flannel shirt. Victoria studied the photograph for several silent seconds. There was no dramatic pose, no attempt to look heroic. He simply looked like an ordinary father returning home after work. A faint smile touched her face. "That is him." Her chief of staff looked up from a folder. "Would you like us to arrange a private meeting?" Victoria slowly shook her head. "No. If he values a quiet life, then we will respect that. We will thank him properly, but we will do it with dignity." By mid-morning, 3 identical black Cadillacs departed the corporate headquarters, each polished to perfection, yet traveling without unnecessary attention. No television crews followed. No press releases were issued. Only Victoria, 2 trusted advisors, and a small security detail made the journey toward the modest neighborhood where Ethan and Lily lived. Back on Maple Ridge Lane, Ethan had returned home for lunch, carrying a paper bag filled with grilled cheese sandwiches from the diner across town. Lily sat at the kitchen table, finishing her homework while humming softly to herself. They laughed over a spelling mistake, and Ethan promised to help her practice before dinner. Then a distant sound interrupted the peaceful afternoon. Not sirens, not construction equipment. The smooth, synchronized hum of 3 luxury sedans turning onto their quiet street. Curtains shifted all along the neighborhood. Front doors opened one after another. Curious whispers floated through the warm summer air as the elegant procession slowed before Ethan's weathered farmhouse. He looked through the front window with puzzled eyes, set the lunch bag gently on the counter, and walked toward the porch, completely unaware that the woman stepping out of the middle Cadillac had spent the entire night searching for the quiet stranger who had changed her future forever. Victoria walked slowly across the front yard until she stood only a few feet from Ethan. The morning breeze stirred the maple trees overhead while the entire neighborhood watched in complete silence. Ethan searched her face once again, trying to understand why someone so clearly accustomed to boardrooms and private aircraft would come all the way to his small farmhouse. Then recognition settled gently into place. The blue eyes, the calm expression, the woman from the aircraft. "You are the passenger from the lake," he said quietly. Victoria smiled, and for the first time since the storm, the weight she had carried seemed to ease. "Yes," she answered softly, "and I finally have the chance to." Thank the man who walked away before anyone even learned his name. Ethan lowered his eyes with a modest shrug. Anyone would have done the same. Several neighbors exchanged doubtful glances. Everyone on the street knew that was simply not true. Victoria took one slow step closer. "No," she replied. "Many people called for help. You became the help." Her words settled over the crowd with unexpected warmth. Lily stood beside her father, holding his hand while looking curiously at the elegant visitor. Victoria noticed the little girl and knelt until they were eye level. "You must be Lily." The child nodded politely. "Daddy said the people on the airplane were safe." Victoria smiled through eyes beginning to glisten. "They are safe because your father reminded every one of us what courage looks like." She reached into her handbag and carefully removed the small leather journal Ethan had unknowingly helped save. The edges were still slightly wrinkled from the water. She held it gently against her heart before speaking again. "Yesterday, I told you that my name could wait. Today, I owe you the truth. I am Victoria Sterling, Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Aerospace." A quiet murmur spread through the neighbors as several people immediately recognized the name. Ethan simply nodded. The title meant very little to him compared with the person standing before him. Victoria continued with a voice that remained steady despite the emotion behind every word. "There is something you could not have known. I was not the only life you protected yesterday." She rested one hand gently across her stomach. Ethan looked at her with growing understanding, and she offered a grateful smile. "I'm expecting a baby. My physicians examined both of us last night, and they assured me that everything is well. You did not simply help a stranger reach shore. You gave a child the chance to grow up knowing his mother." Ethan stood speechless. The neighborhood became so quiet that only the distant song of a meadowlark could be heard drifting across the open fields. Lily squeezed her father's hand and looked up with proud eyes. Victoria's voice grew softer. "For years I believed success was measured by buildings, companies, and numbers on financial reports. Yesterday, a mechanic wearing a rain-soaked flannel shirt reminded me that the greatest measure of a person is what they choose to do when nobody is watching." Without another word, she stepped forward and embraced Ethan once more. This time he gently returned the embrace with quiet respect. There was no applause, no cameras, no dramatic celebration, only the stillness that follows a moment of genuine grace. Standing a short distance away, Victoria's chief of staff watched silently before walking toward the lead Cadillac. He retrieved a slim leather portfolio, glanced respectfully at Victoria, and then approached Ethan with an expression that suggested this remarkable morning was only beginning. The chief of staff handed the leather portfolio to Victoria, but instead of opening it herself, she placed it gently into Ethan's hands. He looked at it for a moment before shaking his head. "I appreciate your kindness, but I did not help you because I wanted anything." Victoria smiled as though she had expected exactly that answer. "I know," she said quietly. "That is precisely why I came." Ethan hesitated before opening the portfolio. Inside was not a check, nor a contract filled with impossible promises. Instead, the first page contained architectural drawings of a modern community emergency response garage built beside Walker Auto Repair. The second page outlined a partnership funded by the Sterling Foundation to provide free roadside assistance and emergency rescue training for rural communities across Nebraska. The third page established a college education trust for Lily, available whenever she chose her own future, with no conditions attached. Ethan looked up, visibly overwhelmed. "This is far too much." Victoria gently folded the folder closed. "No," she answered. Money disappears. Gratitude should build something that remains. The neighbors listened in complete silence. Ben, who had quietly arrived from the garage after hearing about the unusual visitors, stared at the plans with disbelief. Ethan, he whispered, "This is the rescue center you always talked about after those volunteer training weekends." Ethan laughed softly, almost embarrassed. It was only an idea. Victoria looked at him with calm certainty. Every meaningful place begins as an idea in the heart of someone willing to serve. Lily carefully tugged on Victoria's sleeve. "Does this mean Daddy can help even more people?" Victoria knelt beside her again. "That is exactly what it means." Lily's smile grew brighter than the afternoon sun. "Mom always said Daddy could fix almost anything." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment, remembering the woman whose painted sign still hung above his garage door. Honest work matters. Victoria noticed the weathered sign swaying gently in the breeze. "Your wife painted that, did not she?" Ethan nodded. She believed character lasted longer than success. Victoria studied the faded letters with quiet admiration. She was right. One of the security team carried several framed architectural renderings from the Cadillac and placed them carefully on the porch. None of them displayed the sterling name in oversized letters. The design featured only one simple inscription above the entrance: "The Walker Community Rescue Center." Ethan immediately shook his head. "Please do not name it after me." Victoria answered without hesitation. "It is not named after a hero. It is named after a standard. Every volunteer who walks through those doors should remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things without expecting applause." Ethan looked across the front yard where neighbors, friends, and strangers stood together in respectful silence. For the first time since losing his wife, he felt that the future no longer looked like a road he had to carry alone. Before returning to her car, Victoria turned back once more. "There is one more request," she said with a warm smile. "Not as a chief executive officer, simply as someone who owes you more than she can ever repay. I hope this is not the last time Lily and I share lunch together." Lily looked immediately toward her father with hopeful eyes. Ethan smiled, the quiet kind that reached all the way to his eyes. "Our table has always had room for one more chair." As the afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across Maple Ridge Lane, Victoria realized that the greatest gift she had received had never been rescue from the storm. It was an invitation into a home where dignity, kindness, and second chances were simply the way people lived every single day. 1 year later, the morning sun rose over Ashford exactly as it always had, painting the open fields in shades of gold while the sound of laughter drifted across the newly completed Walker Community Rescue Center. The building stood beside the original garage, not as a monument to one man, but as a promise kept. Volunteer firefighters trained alongside high school students. Retired paramedics shared decades of experience with young families learning first aid. Every Saturday, the parking lot filled with pickup trucks, farm vehicles, and neighbors who believed that serving others was still the strongest foundation a community could build. Ethan continued wearing the same work boots, the same faded flannel shirts, and the same quiet smile that had never depended on recognition. He still repaired old engines before sunrise, still refused to charge families for repairs they could not afford, and still pointed toward the weathered wooden sign painted years earlier by his wife. Honest work matters. He had been offered interviews, awards, and invitations to speak across the country, but he accepted only one honor: watching ordinary people discover that courage belonged to them too. Inside the classroom, overlooking the service bays, Lily carefully organized emergency supply kits beside several younger children. She had grown taller, more confident, and carried herself with the same gentle kindness her parents had taught her. Whenever someone thanked her father for changing their lives, she simply smiled and answered, "He says helping people is just what neighbors do." Across the parking lot, a familiar black Cadillac rolled quietly to a stop without drawing attention. Victoria stepped out carrying a homemade apple pie instead of a briefcase. Her little son, Benjamin, laughed as she lifted him into her arms. The bright afternoon breeze played gently through the trees while he reached toward Ethan with curious blue eyes that reflected the same quiet gratitude his mother still carried every single day. Ethan welcomed them with a warmth reserved for family rather than distinguished guests. Lily hurried over and gently took Benjamin's tiny hand. "Come on," she said happily. "The birdhouse has baby robins now." The two children wandered toward the old maple tree while the adults watched with peaceful smiles. Victoria looked around the busy rescue center before turning toward Ethan. "A year ago, I thought I came here to repay a debt," she said softly. "Now I understand there was never a debt to repay. There was only a lesson to learn." Ethan leaned against the porch railing, listening to the wind chime sing the same quiet melody it had played on the morning she first arrived. What lesson was that? Victoria smiled. That dignity does not announce itself. It simply shows up when someone needs it most. They stood together without speaking for several moments as volunteers prepared for another training exercise and children chased one another across the green grass. No reporters waited outside the gate. No cameras recorded the moment. None were needed. The greatest stories rarely ask to be noticed. They simply change lives one quiet choice at a time. As the evening sun settled beyond the Nebraska horizon, its golden light reflected across the windows of the little farmhouse, the old garage, and the rescue center standing side by side. Ethan realized that the miracle had never arrived in the form of luxury cars, generous gifts, or public recognition. The real miracle had begun the instant one ordinary man chose compassion over hesitation, and another ordinary family discovered that the smallest act of selfless courage could echo through generations yet to come. Sometimes the world does not become better because powerful people change it. Sometimes it becomes better because one humble person quietly reminds everyone else who they were always capable of becoming.